Hi everyone. Today, as you can probably tell by the change in decor, I'm going to be recording a video about the Sherman tank, specifically Sherman tanks that were sent as Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. If you follow me on social media, you probably know that I did an AMA on Reddit a couple of weeks ago, and there were a couple of questions that came up more than once, so I just decided to do a video on some of these as they deserve more discussion. So without a further ado, let's begin. Question one was, how did the Sherman perform in battle? What was the Soviet popular opinion about the Sherman compared to the American popular opinion? Uh, I mean, the Sherman was fine. That's something that I kind of want to get to very early on in this video, and it's a theme throughout my book. The Sherman was a medium tank in the 30-ton class, same as the T-34. It was used for exactly the same purposes as the T-34 medium tank, sometimes fighting shoulder to shoulder with other T-34 tanks within the same battalion. Even might have a mix of Shermans or T-34s. So there was, I hear stories about how the Sherman was an elite tank. It was only given to guards units. It was only given to exceptional crews. Commanders with some kind of privilege. Absolutely no such thing. It was handed out to, if a unit needed reinforcements, it would get whatever was next on the block. It was either Shermans or T-34s. And like I said, they fought shoulder to shoulder. There's plenty of examples of this. So neither tank was really considered better or worse by the Red Army. In terms of popular opinion, well, the thing is that the Sherman doesn't really have a presence in Soviet popular opinion. Like, if you could probably find in the US people with strong opinions about the Sherman, even if they don't really know much about World War II. You can't really find people with strong opinions about, I don't know, the Churchill tank or the Valentine, right? These aren't really tanks that were captured in popular consciousness. And in the USSR, you had tens of thousands of T-34s, 4,000 Shermans, right? 4,000 is a lot of Shermans, but there wasn't really that kind of popular culture presence like you had in the United States to build up any kind of public opinion. All right, question two. How much support did the Americans offer? How much feedback was there? So there was actually quite a bit of support and feedback. So first and foremost, the Americans and the British actually established a military mission in the Soviet Union to exchange information with the USSR, including information on armored vehicles. There were also delegations from the United States who came over. These helped train Soviet crews, Soviet repair teams, Soviet instructors as well. And so to kind of help the USSR both operate their tanks and train themselves to operate these tanks going forward. These delegations also handled complaints that had to do with shipping. So there were a lot of complaints about, tanks weren't packed up properly, so they would arrive rusted. There was no antifreeze in them, so the batteries would burst. Oftentimes spare parts were packaged very poorly. They're just kind of thrown loose into a box, so they would arrive broken and unusable. So all of these things the USSR kind of communicated to the Americans. The Americans sent information back home, and these processes were improved as the war went on. This was also, there was an exchange around how the tanks were performing in service. So there were complaints from the front lines that the armor was bad quality, road wheels, track links didn't last too long. There were a lot of problems with engine injectors, and so all these things went through the American military mission, and they did go back to the United States, and these problems they were resolved. Before someone says, "Oh, the Russians are just making up stuff because they don't want to admit American tanks are good," the British were experiencing largely the same problems, and I did make an effort to highlight that in my book. There is a chapter on the use of the Sherman tank in the British Army, in the Canadian Army, in North Africa, and in Italy. So these issues are definitely not Soviet exclusive. So another interesting thing is that the USSR actually did send delegations out to the American factories to see how Sherman tanks were produced, to see how they were tested. One of these delegations arrived at the Chrysler factory in Detroit, and actually that's where the Americans tried to convince the USSR that they should take M4A4 tanks rather than the M4A2 because they're saying, there's a shortage of diesel engines. We might stop production of M4A2s altogether. But M4A4 is, hey, lots of car engines, right? We can build these tanks, all day long. Claiming to do 1,000 per day, I think, and that is a figure that they actually reached at 1,000 per month, just at the factory. So there were indeed a lot of M4A4s, but the Soviet delegation was not convinced. They decided to stick with the M4A2. All right, question 3. Were there any concerns about handing over latest technology to a foreign nation? So this is actually a pretty good question. As far as I can tell, there was not. So the Soviet Shermans, the M4A2s that arrived in the USSR, they had all the exact same features as Sherman M4A2s used by the USMC or Sherman 3s used by the British or Canadian armies. So you had the same 76mm gun was installed when it was around the same time the Americans got theirs, maybe even a little earlier. HVSS suspension, exactly, they got it around the same time. Wet ammo racks, stabilizers, all the technology was there. It wasn't like an export model that was cut down. The Americans, they even shipped Pershing tanks, 2 Pershings to the USSR towards the end of the war to kind of get, so the USSR could evaluate them. Obviously, there wasn't any chance that they would ever get these tanks in any large amounts. Even the British didn't get them in any large amounts. And I mean, they didn't even see service with the United States Army during World War II in any large amounts. So there definitely did not seem to be any reservation about giving these tanks to the USSR. This, of course, is a topic for further study. Personally, I don't study the sort of political side of things. I would definitely be interested if somebody looks at the archives from more of the high level. Can we trust the Soviets? Can we send them all our best stuff? I would be interested in seeing those documents, but I personally did not see any kind of reservation around that. Interestingly enough, I've seen some from the British where they said that they don't want to send Churchill tanks to the Red Army because they'd blow their cover. They would send them to battle right away. They'd lose them, in small numbers without reaching any effect. They'd start losing them. The Germans would get information about Britain's newest tank. And ironically, the British went on and did exactly that same thing in August of 1942 at Dieppe. So a reasonable follow-up to that question is, were elements of Sherman tank design incorporated into Soviet designs? There are actually some influences that I've identified that were said to be worthy of imitation. So the commander's cupola on the Sherman tanks with 76mm guns was considered quite good. I've seen a recommendation to install it on the IS-3. That never happened. It was also used in a design, I believe, of an IS-7 prototype. That was never accepted to mass production. A suspension similar to the Sherman's HVSS was used on one IS-7 prototype. Again, not a production. The M10 periscope served as a basis for a periscope used on the Su-85B light SPG, experimental only. There's actually a Soviet general, whose name escapes me at the moment, who identified the Sherman tracks as actually being quite worthy of imitation on a universal tank, perfect tank that he described. So this tank would have an IS-3 turret, a T-34 hull, and Sherman, T-34 style hull, IS-3 style turret, but also Sherman style tracks. He quite liked the tracks, except the traction was quite bad. But aside from that, he said, if we can get the traction issues resolved, these are great tracks. We should use them on our tanks. I've seen some claims that the 50 cal pintle mount was copied for the IS-2 and later the T-54. That's not really the case. The Soviet anti-aircraft gun mounts they were original, and there were several years between when the USSR first saw these American mounts and mounted their own 50 cal on top of their own tanks. So it's a completely different design. There were also 7.62 millimeter AA machine guns on older Soviet tanks, so you can't even say that the USSR got the idea from the Americans. So there was actually one bit that was copied. That was the GM 671 engine, the diesel engine. It wasn't copied for tanks; it was copied for tractors, and I think light vehicles as well. But that was the only aspect of the Sherman tank that was used in Soviet industry in large numbers. Which features were the most liked and which were the least liked? So one of the ones that was the most liked was the 50 cal on the pintle mount. There were significant issues with the pintle mount, same as the Americans experienced. So it was hanging right in front of the commander's hatch, which on earlier Sherman tanks was the only hatch in the turret. And if you ever needed to bail out of your tank quickly, it really got in the way. And again, same problem experienced by the British. They do mention it in documents. So this was kind of a mix. This was invaluable to have when you're driving around and you need to fight off aircraft, because especially in the summer of 1944, the Red Army Air Force couldn't keep up with Soviet advances. So these 50 cals were often the tank's only recourse against enemy aircraft. On the other hand, it gets in the way when you're actually in battle. Another reason, of course, is once you're fighting in the cities, it becomes very useful again, because you can fire these 50 cals at top floors of buildings to clear them out from enemy infantry, and the same thing was done with Soviet 12.7 millimeter machine guns as well. The reliability of the tanks came up quite a bit. So generally they were very reliable, again, except for the tracks and road wheels. Those tended to have a lower lifespan than the rest of the tanks. Just mechanically, they'd wear out after a couple of 100 kilometers. Later on, this lifespan did improve, but this was a sore point in Sherman tank deliveries until the end of the war. The clutch as well was an exception. I start seeing the issues with frequent clutch adjustment kind of early on. They're very common. Later on, they taper off. I don't know if that was because of training or because for any mechanical reasons. This is again something that also shows up in British documents. As I mentioned, reliability, this is something that comes up quite a bit and came up in a video of mine. Just to reiterate, the reliability of the Sherman and the T-34 was considered the same. The 9th Mechanized Corps estimated that each of the tanks can expend 200-250 engine hours and drive between 2,500-3,000 kilometers. Of course, that's in ideal conditions. Usually the distance traveled was less, simply because of how difficult the roads were and traveling at lower speeds. T-34 and Sherman tanks, when they were used in Manchuria in just absolutely the harshest conditions you can possibly put your armored vehicles through, blazing sun, torrential rain towards the end of the campaign, each tank had to drive between 1,000 and 1,600 kilometers in that operation. Both the T-34, T-35, and the Sherman tanks, a mix of M4A2 76Ws with VVSS and HVSS suspensions. So 87% arrived at the destination of both the tanks. So the reliability was very good, equivalent to that of the T-34. So there are some things that crews did not like. And again, it depends on each individual crewman's tastes. Some of them did not like the vision from the Sherman, which kind of confused me for a little bit until I read some more into studies of Soviet tanks and their vision. And the part that they were specifically upset about is vision sideways. So on comparing the older Sherman models and older T-34s, the Commander in both cases has a rotating periscope, but in a T-34, the loader and the Commander have slits, either periscopes or vision slits that point sideways. And so having this kind of backup vision was actually considered very important. Whereas in the Sherman, you have maybe your pistol port for looking out back. That's not really helpful for vision. So that's one aspect that some crews complained about. Some just didn't mention at all. So it depends on beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. So I mentioned the tracks before. Reliability of the tracks was one thing, but traction was quite poor. Sherman's with various kinds of tracks were received by the USSR. Typically, they're depicted with T-49 parallel bar tracks. T-54E1s were also not uncommon. There were T-41s, the smooth rubber ones as well. There were a whole bunch of designs that you can see in photos. None of them were considered really satisfactory. So there were quite a few award orders that I've read where somebody actually had to get out of a tank in the battle and throw branches onto an icy slope or sand on the icy slope so the tank could climb. That was the kind of thing that you had to resort to get tanks to climb steep slopes covered in ice. T-34s did not have that problem, so that was something that the T-34 was said to excel at compared to the Sherman. The tracks are quite narrow as well and sank in the snow. There were some attempts to weld spent track pins to the surface of the track link to get better traction in these conditions, but as you can imagine, this kind of solution didn't really last very long. So this was an issue that the Red Army identified with Sherman tanks pretty much until the end of the war. Another complaint that I've seen is that the tank is far too tall and the side armor is vertically positioned and too thin. That's, I think, a reasonable complaint. There's also a complaint that armor quality is not good, and this was something that was forwarded onto the Americans as well. And as evidence of that, I've seen a report that you can punch through the side with an anti-tank rifle, but the Soviet anti-tank rifle, the 14.5 millimeter rifle, is quite a powerful weapon, and it could punch through the side of a Panther as well. So I wouldn't say that it was weaker than the T-34s, but I wouldn't call it weak specifically. So another commonly asked question is, how did the ergonomics of the T-34 and the Sherman compare? And of course, the Sherman, as the larger tank, it's taller, it's wider. The turret ring is 1,730 millimeters wide. The T-34, specifically the T-34 76s, is only 1420 millimeters wide, which is reflected on the amount of space that the crewmen have. So in a T-34, again, 76, the crewmen only have 450 millimeters of space width-wise. So 450 millimeters is the width of a standard Soviet man's shoulders, as prescribed by a Soviet ergonomics textbook. So that was just enough space for a crewman to function. Whereas a Sherman crewman could enjoy up to 600 millimeters of shoulder space. So a little bit more room to move around. On the T-34-85, the amount of space for each crewman was actually increased to 500 millimeters, so a little bit better, but the Sherman was still offered more space for its crew. One exception that I've seen is a complaint that the Sherman hatch is too small, it's hard to get out of. I can definitely see that if the person reviewing this tank was familiar with the early Shermans, so the ones where there was indeed only one hatch in the turret. It was the commander's hatch, and everybody had to get out of it. If you compare that to the early T-34s, where there's one hatch in the turret, but it spans the entire width of the turret, and you're much less restricted when you're coming out of it, that, of course, is a whole different situation. That hatch had its own problems, and if you're looking at the hexagonal turret, what's called the Mickey Mouse ear turret, that hatch, I would say no one can claim that it's larger than that of a Sherman's. There is also one complaint that I didn't quite understand in documents. One tank commander wrote that it's difficult for him to command both his tank and his unit at the same time. That might have been a reference to difficulty in using the commander's cupola and the radio. The radios were sometimes in the hull and sometimes British style. They were in the turret. So maybe that's what he was referring to. I'm not quite sure what that complaint was about. A big one from scale modelers. Was the Sherman painted in its original colors, or was it repainted on arrival? This one's quite easy to answer. Sherman tanks, and actually all foreign tanks, were not repainted in 4BO or any other color. You see them in combat with their original markings, which quite often includes shipping markings. Sometimes you actually see tanks with British markings, British unit markings in service with the Red Army. So even if there were other unit markings already, they were not painted over. The exception is being if a tank arrived in the winter, it would be painted with water-soluble white winter camo. Were there any attempts to replace the Sherman with something else? Yeah, there was some attempts. So as I mentioned before, the Americans tried to offer the USSR M4A4s instead of the M4A2. It was evaluated. Two of them were sent to the USSR. The exact details of it are also covered in my book. And the conclusion they came to is that the M4A4 is not as good as the M4A2. I believe they liked the traverse mechanism better and they liked the tracks better, but both of these changes were available in the M4A2. So they simply decided to wait until more M4A2s were available. Specifically, the issues that they had with the Chrysler multi-bank engine, as the same with the British and the Canadians, who were originally quite resistant to this type of tank. They considered it would be very difficult to maintain because, for those of you who don't know, the Chrysler multi-bank engine is just 5 car engines stuck together. And the USSR, the representatives looked at that and they went, no way, we're not going to maintain that. But a much more serious issue was fuel consumption. So this tank was consuming considerably more fuel than the M4A2. And while the M4A2 could use diesel fuel, the M4A4 had to use high-quality aircraft gasoline. Which was quite difficult to come across in the USSR. It was quite valuable, reserved for aircraft. The British actually also tried to replace the M4A2 as they quite liked it and wanted to keep as much of them as possible for themselves. So they offered the Red Army the Crusader, which was declined in part due to very bad experiences with the Liberty engine. They offered the Centaur, again declined in part due to the Liberty engine. They offered the Cromwell, and actually 2 of these tanks were sent to the USSR for trials in 1944. Evaluations showed that they were markedly inferior to both the T-34 and the Sherman, and no further orders were made. All right, final question, and I think one of the more important ones. What do I think about Dmitry Loza's book, in Russian it's called Tankistny na Marke, a tanker on a foreign vehicle. In English, the title is a little bit longer, something like Commanding Red Army's Sherman Tanks. This book comes up quite a lot. Again, if you follow me on social media, you've probably seen where if I post something about the book, someone says, Loza wrote this about it, or this isn't true. This is how Loza wrote about it. Loza's book it's a memoir. Memoirs are not ideal at communicating facts. What they are about is they're about feelings, and so it's a good source for how a Sherman unit commander could have felt during when he was driving a foreign tank. And there are some curious anecdotes in it, but it's not his. Even though he was a battalion commander, his scope was quite limited. So I would say that it's definitely an important book for you to read if you're interested in the service of Sherman tanks in the Red Army. It's not a replacement for what I had information in my book. Of course, the information in my book is not a replacement for information in that book. But just keep in mind, it is a memoir. Same as Death Traps, right? Death Traps is a memoir. There's information in it about how Belton Cooper felt about the Sherman tank. You probably should not use it as subjective source of truth and your only source of truth for evaluation of the Sherman tank. Now, there is an anecdote in Loz's book about Soviet infantry stealing the seat covers for boots. And, a couple of people asked me if that's true or not. Never say never. It might have happened, but there were definitely no reports of this that I've come across. There are reports of soldiers stealing, whatever from tanks that are poorly guarded. There's a report where some Matilda tanks had the radios stolen because another unit needed some more radios. So if I would say that if somebody's troops were sneaking up on Sherman units and stealing stuff from their tank, it would definitely have shown up in some report somewhere. Haven't seen one of those yet, but it's quite possible that it happened. Who knows? All right, that's it. These are all the questions that I prepared. If you want to read the entire AMA, there is a link available in the description below. And if you want to learn more about the M4A2 tank and the M4A4 tank in Soviet service, you are, of course, welcome to purchase Sherman tanks of the Red Army. It should be available worldwide by now. There are also links in the description below. Thank you for watching.